Nicole Fox will walk you through the steps on that.
Thanks, John. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. I feel a little bit like I'm singing karaoke here. You guys wouldn't want that to happen, nor would I, but it's kind of interesting holding on to this mic. Okay, so like John said, I'm here to talk about the initial project development stage. And I work in the Office of Local Systems along with John and Donna, who have been up here, and Tammy, that you got to meet earlier if you hadn't met her already. Okay, so we're going to talk about project scheduling and submittals, the consultant selection process, the concept statement and funding agreement, and tracking your project in TPMS, which again is Transportation Project Management System. So the typical sequence would be that you would select your consultant, and then you would do a concept statement and funding agreement. Usually once you turn in that concept statement, that's what triggers that funding agreement to be sent out to you. And then you start working on your preliminary plans. And during the phase between the concept statement and the preliminary plans, and sometimes a little bit after preliminary plans, is when you'll receive environmental concurrence. After, and only after, you receive environmental concurrence can you start your right-of-way acquisition process. Then you can work on your check and final plans, again, only after you receive environmental concurrence. Then you'll have the project letting, and you'll go to construction. So for that environmental concurrence, these first two, the environmental impact statement and the environmental assessment, aren't going to apply to too many of you guys' projects. Most of what you're going to be doing is a programmatic categorical exclusion, that's what that CE stands for there, or a programmatic or individual categorical exclusion if you need some right-of-way, or if you need minimal right-of-way, then that takes a little bit less time. Or no right-of-way at all would also take less time. So for more information, you can take a look at the guide in section 3. You can also look at IM 3.002, the Federal Aid Project Scheduling IM, or the IM 3.005, the Project Development Submittal Dates and Information. So this is a snapshot of the critical path dates. As you can see, for a major project, we're looking at a year from concept to letting. For a minor project, we're looking at 6 months from concept to letting date. And there's a blown up version of that in that IM 3.005 that I referenced. And it has more current dates in it too. So then the consultant selection process, kind of some general requirements for federally funded consultant contracts. The selection must be qualifications based. So we're used to doing things in construction, low bid. This is not low bid, it's qualifications based. So that's something that's kind of different than our typical process that you should remember about consultant selection. And then DOT review and approval of the consultant contract is required. If you're using the abbreviated selection process, you can only do that if the total consultant services are going to be less than $150,000. And you should consider setting a DVE goal. At least 3 DOT pre-qualified firms must be considered. And then you should list the firms that are considered and request DOT approval to begin negotiations with that firm that you have deemed the most qualified. So only then is when you start talking about costs. The full selection process is required if the total consultant services will exceed $150,000. You'll need to form a selection committee and establish evaluation criteria. How are you going to rate each consultant? Prepare an RFP and send that to prospective firms. Those firms are not required to be on the DOT list. And then you should evaluate those proposals and conduct consultant interviews if you believe that is necessary, the interview part. And then from there, you select the most qualified firm, and you evaluate their good faith effort on the DBE goal. For more information, you can look at IM 3.305, Federal Aid Participation and Consultant Costs. We've recently made some changes to this IM. I think that was updated with our February 29th IM revision notice. So it's fairly new. It's also fairly lengthy, so as a lot of our IMs get, but it does do a good job of explaining that whole process. So the concept statement. Right now, this is a form that you fill out and you send in through TPMS. Something that we've been working on in our office, and we've been getting some assistance from Location and Environment and also the Service Bureau. We're looking at doing kind of an electronic concept statement and updating that a little bit. I think Deanne Newell from Location and Environment says it best that it might be like TurboTax, but for the concept statement. So you know how TurboTax asks you certain questions, and then from there it might ask you more questions. So that's what we kind of have envisioned for this concept statement. It's not very far along at this point, so it's not going to be out next week or anything, but stay tuned for more information on that. We are hoping to make it a little bit easier for you guys to fill out. The purpose of the concept statement will remain the same once we get it updated. It initiates project development. It provides the LPA's contact information for all the various entities at the DOT and other entities to look at and know who they need to get a hold of. It kind of defines the general scope of the project and the project description. It helps our environmental office with their review and the documentation that will be required. It also helps determine which permits or agreements may be needed. And kind of my goal, it might be utopia, as Donna likes to say, but kind of my goal is that with this electronic concept statement, it would kind of spit out a list of you need to apply for these following permits type of thing for your project. So that's my goal. I don't know. Again, stay tuned. More to come on that. But I'm hoping that that's what it'll do and kind of try to make things a little bit easier for you guys so you can, you know, check off the boxes and stuff. TPMS kind of does that already, but sometimes it's nice to just have a checklist. And then it also documents your proposed design, what design requirements you're using and such. So the administering office performs a general review for completeness. So that's usually your district local systems engineer or technician, but sometimes it's systems planning depending on who your project is being run through. And then they will review the proposed design values as well. Location and Environment uses it to determine the level of environmental impacts and what kind of additional documentation might be required. And then the Office of Right-of-Way uses it as well to identify those projects that have right-of-way needs. And that way they've got that information if it becomes necessary for you to call them and have them help you through that right-of-way process. Sometimes the environmental data sheet is also needed, depending on how you answer certain questions on the concept statement. That provides additional details about possible impacts to recreation areas. Sometimes we refer to that as 4F and 6F. Wildlife areas, threatened and endangered species, and there's a form for threatened and endangered species now as well. That information is in IM 3.111, which was also recently updated. So you guys can take a look at that for more information on threatened and endangered species. IMs covering the concept statement and the environmental data sheet are listed at the bottom here. So then, like I mentioned at the beginning, the funding agreement gets started after we receive a concept statement. This is basically the written agreement between the DOT and the LPA, and it outlines the responsibilities of each party and what applicable federal guidelines you'll need to follow. It also identifies the funding sources and the amount of funding that you'll have on each particular project. So this should be completed as early as possible. The DOT will do this for you and send it to you. And then typically that's just before or after the concept statement. So Transportation Program Management System, TPMS, that is the online system that's provided by the Iowa County Engineers Association Service Bureau. County budgets and 5-year programs are housed inside of that program. And then, like Donna mentioned earlier, they can submit their projects for federal aid into the TIP through that program. And then the development side has all the projects, and that's for cities, counties, and consultants who are working on a project for a city or county. I think that you could request that through Steve DeVries at the Service Bureau. I think in the last slide here, there's some contact information for him. If there's not, I got his number memorized, so I'll give that to you. Steve and I talk about it every other day, so. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, if you're not a county engineer or a city mayor or city clerk or a consultant, how do you get access to that? And so the answer was that I think that you contact Steve at the Service Bureau. So here's kind of a screenshot, like what your district local systems engineer or your district local or your local systems central office where I'm at would see. So here is, you can see at the very top District 1, and then it's various sponsors in District 1 that had projects at the time that this screenshot was taken. And then if you drill down into an individual project, this is what your screen looks like. As you can see, there's the concept statement is in there, and it says that that's been cleared by the district, and it says who did that. GD, that's Greg Durbin. He's the District 1 local systems engineer. And then it tells you your preliminary plans are due on a particular date, and that these are the other things that you're going to have to do. You've got to do DOT hydraulic review and structural review, and then as with any project, you have to do check plans, final plans, and a project development cert, and then you, of course, have to turn the project in for letting. And then it shows the agreement. So the files are in there too. If you wanted to pull the file out, you know, you can just leave it in there, you can print it, do whatever you want there. So the projects, as we've mentioned, need to be included in the TIP and the STIP, and then they can get activated for development. The LPA or the consultant can enter the initial project information like the letting date, activate the project, things like that. And then the DOT verifies that information in TPMS. And like we just showed, the DOT can mark project submittals and clearances as they happen. And that data gets synchronized with the Iowa DOT's project scheduling system, PSS we call that. That happens daily, like around midnight, I think. So sometimes, you know, somebody does something at noon and then they're wondering, why is it not showing me this at 3 o'clock? Well, that's because the update happens overnight when no one is using the system. At least we assume no one's using the system at midnight. So then TPMS has automated monitoring. Basically, if it sees that you're late for one of your submittals, it will send you an email asking you to take action. And then if you do not take said action after a given amount of time, I don't know if that's like a week or so, but the second notice just resets your letting date for you. So they're serious on that first notice. So you might want to do something, take some action, reset the letting date yourself, or submit whatever it is you need to submit. Maybe you just forgot. Maybe it's not done yet, and that's okay. Then resetting the letting date is what we would need to do there. It has a built-in email tool that you can use for your project submittals, and then you can use that to mark the clearances, track basic correspondence, things like that. And like I said, all those files can be uploaded or downloaded or stored in the system. Okay, there's Steve's contact information. So Steve DeVries works at the Service Bureau, and he's the one that can get you set up if you're not already set up for this system. We referenced a lot of documents in there, all of those IMs that I talked about. So you can refer to those if you need more guidance on this. And we're always available by phone or email as well, whether it be Local Systems Central or your district local systems engineer or your sponsor in systems planning. We are available for questions. Okay, I'll turn it back over to John now. Yes.
Like, can a contractor request to have access to TPMS and see what's budgeted and uploaded? Or is this strictly for designers?
Okay, so I'll repeat the question here. So the question was, can a contractor have access to TPMS? And the answer to that is no, because TPMS is just the preliminary side of things. It's before the letting. So I don't think we'd want to allow our contractors to have access to that because, you know, obviously a lot can change in the preliminary plan stage before final plans, and then all those projects, except for a few select types of projects through systems planning, they all get let at the Office of Contracts, so contractors have their ability to bid on those once they get turned in for letting. Does that answer your question? Okay. Sure. Yeah, so I think if they, you know, I think if a county engineer wanted to share the information as to what is programmed with local contractors, I think they're free to do so if that's the county engineer's choice. But allowing them access, I think, is probably something that the counties don't want to get into. The counties are the only ones that have their projects programmed through TPMS for their 5-year program. So cities just program through the TIP and the STIP, which that's online, I believe. So they would be able to see that.
And a city or a county could add this, their STIP or their TIP, put that online if contractors want to see what's coming up as well.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, as far as allowing them access, that idea has not really been kicked around much. Are there any other questions for me? Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to John and we'll get our next speaker going. Okay.
All right, thanks, Nicole. So we'll go over the typical project sequence again. Initially, you program your projects. You select a consultant, develop a project concept, and sign the federal aid funding agreement that we would present to you. And now we'll talk a little bit about the environmental review. We have, this is key to the rest of the federal aid project. We recommend completion before final design or right-of-way acquisitions begin, that you complete your environmental review before you get too far into the project. There's been a few changes with MAP 21, and those changes were carried over into the FAST Act as well. So next we have Mary Kay Solzberg, an environmental specialist senior, Deanne Newell, NEPA team leader, and Brennan Dolan, the cultural resources section, all from the location of environment, Office of Location and Environment, to talk a little bit about environmental review.
Oh, too many cords. Oh, look at that. Hi, everybody. There's a lot of people here today. And I'm pretty excited because I'm usually last at the end of the day when everybody's tired and bored, or right before lunch when everybody's hungry. So I get to be first out of the three of us today. So today we're going to talk about threatened and endangered species, which I know everybody loves. Basically just kind of go through the process a little bit. And some of these things are going to be review for a lot of you, and some of you may be new to this, I'm not sure. Basically, why do you need to do Section 7? Well, the easy answer is you're required by law. If you want federal money, you got to do it, or you don't get federal money. But basically, we do this so that we promote stewardship and conservation of species and the habitats they live in. And it makes sure that any action approved by FHWA does not jeopardize the existence of any of the species. I just wanted to call out our website again, in case anybody hasn't looked at it. The IM, as Nicole mentioned, has been updated, but the website has not been updated recently. It's still a lot of good information, but we kind of need to work on updating it a little bit. So what do you do to make sure that your Section 7, that you've done your due diligence and satisfied all the requirements? Well, to start with, you want to review the Iowa DNR's Natural Areas Inventory, and I've got a website up there for you. Donna, do they get hard copy? Do you guys all have hard copies, right? Yes. Okay, some of these websites on your hard copy might be really tiny and hard to read, but it's, there it is. There are two ways you can evaluate the information from the Iowa DNR. You can go to their website, look at the Natural Areas Inventory. It will give you a list of all of the state threatened and endangered species for your county. That can be a little bit overwhelming when you see that list. There can be 50, 60, 70 different things on that list. The other thing that you can do is request an environmental review from the DNR. Just ask them for an environmental review of your project. They will send you back a letter or an email and tell you either, here are some things you need to be worried about in your project area, or they'll say, you know, we don't have any records of anything in your project area. That doesn't mean there isn't anything. That just means they don't have any records. So keep that in mind, as with everything. If you encounter something, there's something out there that nobody knows about, you'll have to deal with it. For the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you go to this website that I've got on there, and you can review a species list for your county. That's a much smaller list. You're talking about less than 10 different species. And a lot of the species are common to many counties or city, areas. So once you kind of get a feel for, on the Fish and Wildlife website, well, I'll show you a little bit later what you can do, but you can print some information, you can keep it in a notebook. Those species don't change very often, and when they do, it's a really big deal and you'll know about it. So you can keep some of the information in a notebook and just refer to it and not necessarily have to go to the website every time, or you can go to the website either way. And then any other information that you have, any other field data, any other soil surveys, any, your county conservation people may have some information about plants or animals that might be in the area. So what you need to do, the bottom line on all of this is we have to determine whether our project is going to have an effect on a threatened endangered species or their habitat. That is the bottom line on all of this. And to do that, they've given us, Fish and Wildlife Service has several types of effects. These are actually regulatory terms. So it seems kind of goofy the way this sounds, but it's in the regs like this. So we have no effect. Your project is not going to affect any species or habitat. May affect, not likely to adversely affect. That is cutting trees down in the winter for bats. That's may affect the bats, but probably not likely to adversely affect them. May affect, likely to adversely affect. Now you're looking at, you can't cut the trees in the winter, you have to cut the trees in the summer, and there are bats in those trees. You're definitely going to adversely affect those bats. We try to stay away from that category if we can. It's easier if there are mitigation measures like cutting them in the winter that you can do. Jeopardy is the bad one. We never, ever want to go to. If you have a project that actually reaches jeopardy, you probably won't be doing that project. Just so we try to stay away from that. Nicole mentioned the determination of effect form. It is form number 76005.doc. And this is what it looks like. And we can run through this fairly quickly. A lot of you have done this many times, so it's review. The very first box is you list the species on the IDNR website or the Fish and Wildlife website. In the past, we've had everybody list everything. Well, people have had to attach 5, 6 pages of paper to get all of the species listed. If you want to list the ones that you're fairly certain you're going to affect, you can do that. With the Fish and Wildlife website, those species, most of the time what we see listed there are the bats. But you need to identify, here's the things that we think might be impacted by this project. The second one, describe the habitat in your project area. This is really important for, obviously, if I'm looking at your determination of effect form, I may or may not have seen your project area. You know, I may have traveled to that part of the state. I may not have. So accurately describing the habitat and putting in photographs is critical, because then something that I might look at and say, oh my gosh, this is horrible. I look at a photo and say, oh, this isn't a big deal. So it's very, very helpful if you can provide photographs. Basically, just describe the setting. Is it rural? Is it agricultural? Is it urban? And what kind of vegetation? Do you have trees? Is it all grass? Is it a lot of weeds? Or are they just scrubby, volunteer, kind of brushy trees? Then once you've done that, you look at the habitat characteristics for your whatever species you think you might impact and determine whether or not your project area has any of that habitat there. Oh, look at that. My box is a little off. So is there habitat? If your answer is no, let's say you're mainly focused on bats and you don't have any trees, check the no box. You are done. You do not need to read further. You do not need to check any additional boxes except for the bottom of the form where it says no effect. You check that, you sign it, you're done. If your answer is yes, then you move on to the next step. So to review those habitat characteristics, you can use the websites. And then, so here's a screenshot from the Fish and Wildlife website. And so there's really, it kind of tells you what they like, a real brief description of the kind of habitat they like. They like forests, trees, and water, basically. For bats, you need lots of trees, water. And so this is what I was talking about when, I'm pointing at the screen. This is what I was talking about when, that you can print off and stick in a notebook or a file somewhere. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has habitat data sheets for all of the species that they list. This gets a little more in, maybe more detail than you want, but a little more detail about the types of habitat they like, where they roost, where they have babies, where they eat. And so these are the kinds of things that you think about when you look at the impacts that your project might have. So let's just say you answered yes. Yes, there's trees. So now what? So now will your project, so people get a little bit confused because they think these two questions are the same question, but they're not. First, what you're looking at is, do I have suitable habitat in the area of my project? And now, will my project actually affect that suitable habitat? You may be doing a bridge project. It may be tree-lined corridor right through a stream area. Are you going to cut any trees down for that bridge project? If the answer is no, then you can move on and you're not going to have any effect. So let's say you say, yeah, I'm going to have to cut those trees down. The next question is, are there measures that can be taken to avoid? Cutting down trees in the winter is not avoiding an impact. It is mitigating an impact. When this says, are there measures that can be taken to avoid impacts? That means I will not cut trees down. So I will not impact any bats. So I think people have been a little bit confused by that, but avoidance means, yeah, there is habitat in the area of my project, but I'm not touching it. So if you say yes to that, yes, I will not cut any of the trees down, and that way I won't impact the bats, then you can go on and say that's a no effect, and you're done, sign the form. If you cannot avoid any impacts, now you get to where you're going to minimize or mitigate your impacts. So this is the spot where, can you minimize? Yes, I can minimize the impacts to the bats in this area because I can cut the trees down in the winter. And so that's where, if you answer yes to I can minimize the impacts, now you're into a may affect but not likely to adversely affect. Decreasing the number, I keep using bats as an example because that's pretty common for everybody, but decreasing the number of trees in an area is going to have an impact on the bats in that area. Is it going to be an adverse impact? Probably not if you leave enough trees. If you clear cut everything, that's probably going to be an adverse effect. But for the most part, most of the projects that everybody's doing, you'll be looking at most likely a may affect, not likely to adversely affect. If your answer is no, I can't minimize the impacts, I am going to clear cut the entire county, then we'll have to do some consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Informal consultation, when you have a may impact but not likely to adversely impact, normally we'll do informal consultation. And what that involves is basically you send the information in to us, and then I will send the information to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and request that here's what we're going to do. We think we might have some impacts. We're going to minimize them by cutting trees in the winter. Do you agree, yes or no? That's actually a lot easier now because there is a FHWA programmatic in place with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So basically, I'll send all that information in. If we don't hear anything within 2 weeks, that means we're good to go. Now, those projects are only projects that are within 100 feet or so of the pavement. So, but which pretty much covers most of the projects that most of you do. And then we'll also, on most occasions, you will be working with the Iowa DNR. Usually, if it's a federally listed species, the DNR is going to be fine with whatever Fish and Wildlife wants to do. Sometimes there are state listed species. And I know there have been some trail projects that have had to adjust the timing a little bit because there might be some endangered plants in the area and they only bloom during the 3rd week in August. So that's the only time that you're going to be able to figure out if they're there or not, and then you have to adjust your timing. But that is something that you guys normally will do with the DNRs to coordinate that. We can certainly give you some advice and help you out in any way we can, but that coordination needs to be done by you with the DNR. Formal consultation, we hopefully will never have to do this on a local project. This is where you have to do a biological assessment, and then once all of that, and that takes a while to get done, and once that's done, the Fish and Wildlife Service has to respond within 30 days saying whether or not they think that what you've written up is adequate, and then they will write a biological opinion that takes, after 90 days, they have 45 days to get that done. I mean, it takes a long time to go through formal. I think some of you may have done biological assessments, and we've done that through informal consultation. It's not quite as in-depth, and we basically had to look at the project and determine what the impacts are, and then usually there might be some best management practices or things you need to do, but they'll usually concur with that. Species-specific information, that's an Indiana bat, and that was actually caught on the Highway 30 Tama Bypass project. So we deal with the same issues that you guys do. Basically review the Fish and Wildlife website, and then all the standard specifications for the DOT have been changed to basically call out winter tree clearing on every project. This is the most current list. It's from 2014, but this is the most current map of Indiana BAC counties for now.
October 1,
First.
is that standard for everybody?
Generally, yeah, that's what the Fish and Wildlife Service has determined, that if you cut trees during that time period, you're not going to impact the bats. Are all basically what you're doing is you're cutting down the trees while the bats are hibernating, so there won't be any bats in the trees. So that's the idea behind those dates. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, are those dates standard for everyone? And so, yeah, they pretty much are. Northern long-eared bat. For those of you in, so this was Indiana bat country in blue. For those of you in yellow, you've never had to deal with bats for the most part, and now you get to deal with the northern long-eared bat also. This was listed as threatened by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service April 2nd of last year. And that's part of the reason that we looked at changing the standard specifications to winter tree clearing, is it kind of makes it easier for everyone. You get in a mindset where you know you've got to schedule your projects accordingly, and these two bats probably won't be the last two that get listed before this is over, so we just figured we might as well get everyone kind of in the habit of looking at winter tree clearing now, and it'll be easier in the long term when other bats get listed. Usually, no. If you determine that there is suitable habitat, then it's possible that you might have to do a survey. So that's something that you can either call us and we can help you with that information, or talk to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I believe on their website they do have a map. It's not specific, they're not dots on the map, but they do have a map of areas where there are known roost trees and known hibernacula for northern long-eared bat. And so if you know your project is in one of those areas, you're probably going to have to do a survey. A lot of times if you're only taking out a half an acre of trees, a survey is probably not necessary.
Question?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, I keep forgetting that. The question was, do you have to do surveys for bats on all projects? Am I running out of time?
No. No, I'm just standing here with a microphone in case somebody has a question.
I thought John was back there doing the cutoff thing for me. So Topeka Shiner, for those of you in the northwest portion of the state, you have to deal with Topeka Shiner. And in those counties, just because you happen to be in a county that is considered part of the range for the Topeka Shiner does not mean that your project is necessarily going to affect the Topeka Shiner. So this is where you just need to look at the habitat requirements for the fish and then see if your project, a lot of projects are over the top of a straightened, channelized, what's basically now a drainage ditch. And so a lot of times you may not have suitable habitat for Topeka Shiner, but you may still be in that county. If you say, no, I don't think there's habitat for it, okay. I mean, there is a chance that somebody somewhere might take a look at that, but you send that to us, we're going to believe that you've checked and that's accurate. When you do have adequate or suitable habitat for Topeka Shiner, you'll need to use our standard note 281-6, which is best management practices. Basically, that means you stay out of the creek or river during spawning season in the spring, and that sometimes is a little bit of a challenge, but we have been able to work things out where a contractor will put in a temporary work pad before spawning season, be able to do what they need to do, and take it out after spawning season. So there are workarounds for that. Everybody sees, oh my God, I can't work in the water, what am I going to do now? There are ways that we can work with that. So just because you might have to do that, it's not, don't panic. Bald eagle is something that's no longer listed as threatened or endangered, but is still protected. So it's not very common that we see bald eagle nests on a lot of these projects, but there could be one every once in a while, and so that's going to be something that you just need to be aware of. Everybody's favorite, migratory birds. Swallows on a bridge are migratory birds. I'm sorry, so are pigeons, some species of pigeons. This one gets a lot trickier. You can't do any construction activities where active nests are present between April 1st and July 15th. So you've got a bridge project. You know you've got a bridge project coming up. What do? There are ways to, they're not easy and they're not fun, but there are ways to be able to do that. We've had some contractors net the bridge, so the birds can't get to the bridge. And then, you know, there's no nests on the bridge, the project goes forward. The other thing that we, the DOT, have had to do, our maintenance people on a couple bridge projects had to go out with broomsticks every 2 or 3 days and knock off every nest that was started until we could get the contractor out there to start the bridge project. They took one garage took a power washer out and power wash it. That sucked. Nobody liked that. So if you can adjust your construction times accordingly, or figure out a way to keep the birds off the bridge before you even get started, and that way the project can move forward on time. So currently, I told you there is a BAT programmatic right now with Fish and Wildlife Service and FHWA. We've been trying to work on a programmatic for the rest of the federal species, and in the hopes that that would streamline review. We're still working on that. I think last year I said we were working on it, and we're still working on it. We're kind of hoping that within the next year we can get something in place. The IM, as Nicole said, has been updated, so you can review that. Mostly it was just tweaked to make it a little easier to understand and change a few things that may have changed. And that's all I have. Any questions? Yes?
When filling out the determination of effects form when filling out the determination of effects form, is that to be at like the individual's level of knowledge at the time, or are you expecting there to be some groundwork done by, say, a biologist?
That's a good question, because that was a question that initially got everybody all upset about filling that form out. There are a lot of things you don't necessarily need a biologist for. For instance, if you're looking for impacts to bats and you're not cutting any trees down. If you know you're not cutting any trees down, then you can fill the form out easily. If there are times where it's a little iffy and you're not clear on whether or not you might be impacting a certain species, that's when you might want to have someone else come in, either a consulting firm or even your county conservation people, if they can come over and take a look. Because if you have all the resources, you know what types of habitat that some of these species like. For instance, the western prairie fringed orchid that I believe is in every county of the state, it likes wet prairies. Is your bridge project a wet prairie? If not, then you probably aren't going to have a western prairie fringed orchid. So there are some common sense things you can do, but yes, there are times when you may have to have someone else come in and take a look at it for you. For the example I used on the trail project that had a very specific species, I believe it was slender lady's tresses, and it only bloomed at a specific time during August or September, then you may have to have somebody with a little more knowledge on plants come in and actually find that. Anyone else? And I will turn it over to Deanne.
I'm Deanne Newell, and I'm going to talk about the NEPA and the Section 4F. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and it's our basic national charter for protection of the environment. NEPA is all about procedures that must ensure that environmental information is available to the public officials and citizens before decisions are made and before actions are taken. You can find NEPA in 40 CFR. It establishes our policy, it sets goals, and it provides the means for carrying them out. 23 CFR supplements 40 CFR, and it's the process for federal highway and other public transportations. This slide displays all the different types of federal environmental laws and executive orders that affect transportation. As you can see, back in the 60s up to the 2000s, that's when a majority of those laws and orders came into effect. So when does NEPA apply? Whenever there's federal funding, a jurisdiction, permit, or approval, you'll need to apply NEPA. 23 CFR breaks down NEPA into 3 different classes. Class 1 is an environmental impact statement. Class 2 is a categorical exclusion, and 3 is environmental assessment. Class 1 environmental impact statements. These are projects that are known to have significant impacts. Examples would be a new road on controlled access freeway or a highway of 4 lanes or more on new alignment. There's 3 basic steps to do an EIS. There's a draft, a final, and then the record of decision. But within those basic steps, there's many more. This kind of shows you the different steps that you'd have to go through the environmental process. And you can kind of see why the majority of our projects over the last 10 years have taken about 6 years to go through the process. Theoretically, it should be only 4, but because of the different types of decisions and the involvement with the public and agencies, it has kind of taken a little longer. So this first slide gets you through the draft EIS. And then once that's completed, we'll go through the final EIS process and eventually into the ROD. An EIS is about developing a purpose and need of your project and then looking at different types of alternatives and the potential impacts out there and comparing them and making the best decision. This display shows you 3 different alternatives with potential impacts. It's all about balance. Key to an environmental impact statement or a NEPA document is your environmental studies. You would do an environmental study to determine what level you need to be documenting your project at, or even to make decisions. Here's a list of all the different types of environmental studies that we'll complete. I was just looking at it earlier and I forgot noise, so there's additional things out there that may not be on our list. Like I said earlier, it's all about getting information from the agencies into the public. So we have several different times throughout the environmental process to get into the agency's ears and talk to the public and get their input. An EIS document is all about full disclosure. You need to tell the entire story, but you need to keep it brief, clear, and concise. You need to clearly demonstrate your regulatory compliance and use appropriate graphs to help the reader get through the process and be in a consistent format. Moving on to a Class 2. Class 2 is pretty much the opposite. These are projects that you know will not have a significant impact. Typical projects would be like pedestrian facilities, landscaping, or general maintenance type projects like bridge replacements, resurfacing. 23 CFR 771117 has lists of C and D list projects, and I've broken down all of those. If you can read, it's pretty small, but these are the basic types of projects that we do and where they fit in the C and D lists. So like we said, CEs do not have significant impacts to planned growth, relocations, natural, cultural, recreational, historic resources, air, noise, and water quality, travel patterns, either individually or cumulatively. Now, we do have a programmatic agreement with Federal Highway, and it says that any of those projects that are on the C list or D list, we can clear them through a programmatic process within our office. You can go to 23 CFR 771.117, just Google it, and you'll come up with that CFR, and that chapter has the C and the D list.
Can you repeat the question again?
He was wondering where we could find that C and D list on our website. Now, with the agreement with Federal Highway, Iowa DOT will certify that these certain projects all met the criteria of the C and D list. And our most recent version of that agreement is back in February of 2012. In the agreement, it says we'll review it every 5 years, so we will be talking with Federal Highway and seeing if there's any adjustments we need to make. Now, we do have a countersigned CE, which is our individual CEs, then we have our programmatic. This display kind of shows you that it's basically the same process, except for when it comes to completing the documentation, it is a countersigned CE is done by the local sponsor and provided to our office. The programmatic CE, all that information is compiled by you, sent in to us, and we will complete the documentation. The countersigned one actually goes to Federal Highway for their review and signature, and the programmatic one is all done within our office and stays at our office for Federal Highway audits. About 98% of our projects fit into that, of the CE projects fit into the programmatic. So only about 2% are actually individual CEs that require Federal Highway review. The next class is an environmental assessment. And this is when you're not quite sure if your project is an EIS, but it doesn't fit the CE criteria because of some type of impact. Some examples would be construction of a new highway interchange or adding lanes on existing highways. And this process is done through 2 steps. An EA, environmental assessment, is completed, and then the next step would be a finding of no significant impacts. If during that process you do find some significant impacts, I would stop the EA and move on to the EIS process. The EA process is real similar to the EA, but it, like I said, it's just done in 2 major steps. And it still has agency input, public input opportunities. The EA document itself, its primary purpose is to help inform Federal Highway and the state agency on whether or not you need to do an EIS or not. It helps address only those resources and features that are likely to be impacted significantly. And it's also a concise document that should not contain long descriptions and detailed information. So we need to just focus in on those resources and issues that are important to your project. I put together statistics over the last few years on how many EAs and CEs and PCEs we have completed. And I have to apologize, my 2015 date numbers are off. For last year, for the EA FONSEs, we only did 3, not 4, and we did 9 CEs. But our PCEs were at 423, and our reevaluations at 225. So yeah, those were a little off, I apologize. So we're pretty consistent on how many we do each year. And we also have the average completion times, which were similar to the slides that Nicole had showed you earlier. EISs, they have typically taken us longer, but there is potential that they wouldn't take that long. It just depends on your particular project and the issues that it has. EAs typically take about 4 years, CEs 16 months, and a PCE could take about 2 months. Once again, all depending on your resources. We've completed NEPA decisions, and about 97% of our projects are the PCEs, 2% CEs, and 1% is an EA. So now I'm going to shift gears a little. I'm going to talk about Section 4F. And Section 4F is all about protecting the the natural beauty of the countryside, public parks, recreation lands, wildlife, and wildfowl refuges, and historic sites. You can find all of that in 49 USC 303 and 23 USC 138. And 23 CFR 774 puts it into federal highway requirements and helps us guide through our process. So we'll focus in on 774. So Section 4F says that federal highway may not approve the use of a land of a significant publicly owned park, recreation area, wildlife or waterfowl refuge, or historic site, unless there's no feasible or prudent alternative, avoidance alternative, or if there's a de minimis impact could be made. So what is feasible and prudent? Feasible means the alternative can be constructed with sound engineering. Prudent, does it make sense? What about all the impacts? Are there unique problems or costs? So you need to weigh that. When it comes to parks and refuges, you really need to talk with the officials with jurisdiction. So if you know you're going to be impacting a park, you need to start talking to them right away. And those would be the individuals that are given the responsibility of managing them. And it gets kind of confusing for us if there's a county park, but it's on federal property or something. There's some management agreements that you would need to talk to both entities. And for historic properties, the official with jurisdiction is the SHPO office, State Historic Preservation Office. So I mentioned de minimis earlier. De minimis has been a wonderful thing that came out in the regulations. It's all about if you have a de minimis impact, that means for a historic site that it will not cause an adverse effect on the historic property. And for parks, it's when it will not adversely affect the features, attributes, and activities that qualify the property for protection. So whenever you do have a park or historic property on your project, we need to determine, number one, if you're going to have a use of that property. So anytime there's one near there, we need to come up with or answer all 5 of these categories. Majority of those could be no 4F, and no 4F means there is one there, but you're not going to touch it, or it's not subject to 4F. So if you have a private golf course on your project and you're going to impact it, it's privately owned, it's not open to the public, then it would not be considered a 4F property. Now that doesn't mean that we shouldn't avoid it. We recommend always trying to avoid any types of those properties, but if it cannot be avoided, it is not a 4F. We have no use, de minimis, programmatic evaluations, and then individual evaluations. If you need to do an individual 4F, that means there's absolutely no way you can avoid it. There's a 2-step process, and it's similar to a draft EIS and final EIS. If you need to do a programmatic 4F, we do have, looks like, 5 opportunities there. We can do programmatics on historic bridges, minor involvements on public parks and rec lands, minor involvements of historic sites, independent bikeway or walkway construction projects, and we can also do net benefits. Now, honestly, we have been doing many of these lately because the de minimis will get us to the same end. And a programmatic 4F means that you do not have to actually go through the total avoidance alternative. Is because of the type of impacts you're going to have on those properties. Section 4F process, I kind of laid out this so you can see that it goes side by side with the NEPA document. So if you have a draft EIS, you also need to be completing your 4F process at the same time because those decisions will impact your NEPA process. Now there are some exceptions in the in 774.13, and these are not saying, oh, this project is a restoration project, we don't have to do it because there's an exception. You still need to coordinate with those officials with jurisdiction to make sure they agree with the decisions you're making about those projects. And they also require federal highway agreement with those decisions. So, NEPA classification. What type of project are you going to be doing? When you send in your federal aid concept, we really encourage you to attach maps and photos. You know, you know your project better than we do, so you really need to provide that information to us. That will help us determine what level of documentation it's going to take for your project. And I know you send those to us early, but if you do have preliminary plans and it's going to indicate what lands you're going to be disturbing, that would be appreciated. List any potential environmental impacts and identify any unusual features that may not be identified in the normal form of the concept. What we'd like to do when we clear your project is clear an area. So if you could provide a shape and say you're going to stay within this area for your project, that's what we're going to clear. And if you get outside of that after we've cleared it, we will reevaluate that area that you've just gone outside of that shape. But you also need to keep in mind that if there's known resources that are near your project, you may need to eliminate those areas from your shape, so you're going to avoid them. So just don't make a big, huge box and think we're going to clear it. Once we determine the classification type, if it fits our PCE process, you're not going to see something from us right away. We're just going to start processing it. But if it's classified as anything higher, like a countersigned CE, EA, or EIS, we'll send you a notice. We'll let you know what it's been classified as, and we'll give you information on how to get started on your project. I want to make clear that when we say it's going to be a CE, we're not saying it's done. This is the start of your process, and I think there's been some confusion in the past. So please look at your emails closely. You'll get emails that say it's been classified as a project, or it'll be the clearance itself. And I guess we need to mention it one more time, that you do need to make sure you have your NEPA clearance prior to moving forward with your final design and right-of-way negotiations. And here's a copy of that clearance that's saying that you're done. So recognize that memo format that's saying your NEPA process is complete. I attached some additional information if you want to find those documents for guidance material. And at this time, I'll take some questions. Yes.
So that NEPA clearance form, is that in the TPMS as well? That email you just showed up there?
We just send them out by email, so it would be your responsibility to make a copy and keep that for your files. Mike?
Maybe just clarify what the expectations versus countersigned CE versus programmatic CE in terms of just the paperwork that's got to do. So the project review form versus the more detailed countersigned.
When you submit your concept, if it was a programmatic CE, we're using all the information you provided in the CE and attachments, or in the concept. If it's a countersigned CE, we're going to expect you to use a new memo format and actually write down and provide detailed information about all the studies that you've completed for the project.
Can you talk about the different levels of public involvement required? Because EA versus a CE versus what might be required for 4F?
Sure. For a countersigned CE, public involvement is not required, but if you do complete public involvement, we want that information included in the documentation. In EA, the only thing that is absolutely required is the public hearing after the signing of the EA, but we encourage public information meetings prior to that, because how else are you going to get the public involved? And EIS is similar. We encourage the public information meetings early on and throughout the process, but the public hearing is required after the draft EIS is signed. And then we'll have additional public meetings after that until the ROD is signed. And for 4F, there is public involvement required when we make a de minimis determination based on park impacts and refuge impacts. But it does not have to be a public meeting. There's other options. There's public notices. There's that you can post on the website, you can do mailings, or you could do newsletters, whatever is good for that public that uses those facilities. Figure out the best way to reach those folks. And here's some additional NEPA folks that you guys can contact if you have questions. And I apologize, another error, I left off Tracy Troutner. That's the newest member of our staff. He is also available, and you've probably seen his name on some of those PCE clearances that have been going out lately. So if there's no other additional questions,
Thanks, Dee. I do want to mention a couple. I'm Brennan Dolan. I'm with Location Environment. I'm a cultural resource manager, archaeologist by training. But I want to make a couple of bullets before I dive into my presentation. When you're working with our office, whether it's Deanne or one of the NEPA staff, or Mary Kay, or Jill, or one of the T&E folks, or anybody out of the cultural resource section, when we provide a recommendation to you as the LPA or the consultant, ultimately what we're trying to provide to you is the smoothest and most predictable project delivery we can get you. So if we make a recommendation, that you might need a biological assessment or a phase 1 archaeological investigation, any kind of recommendation like that, what we're giving you is the smoothest path forward. So if you're an engineer or a planner, you think about going through the design steps. At some point you need that survey data. You got to set a grade, that kind of thing. You need that information. What we do is no different. It's data-driven decision making. So keep that in mind when you're working with our office. Sometimes there's questions or there's uncertainty about a recommendation. Certainly ask those questions. It's imperative that you know what we're in need of. But when you get that recommendation, keep that in mind. The other thing I want to mention specific to our presentation today is if you're familiar with the DOT YouTube channel Need Answers, take a look at that. We just put a field studies video out there that is specifically driven toward the public. So if you're here today, you're working with federal funds, you can use that field studies videos or that specific video, any of the other ones included in there, with working with the public, answering questions, specifically, why someone might need access to a property, that kind of thing. We invested a lot of resources into that, a lot of editing, a lot of time and effort. So do feel free to use that. Field studies, I think it's something we've already seen benefit from some of the folks I work with for the surveys we do for primary road construction, but there's no reason you guys can't use that too. So check out the field studies video. And then lastly, excuse me, we just completed our update of our informational memorandum. So if you're familiar with the cultural resources IM, that recently changed. And one of the things that's reflected in there is a new staffer from our section. So you'll see contact information at the end of my presentation, similar to Deanne's. But the IM does have an updated process. Some of the changes that came about with our most recent statewide programmatic agreement with SHPO, and then also some new staff information. So make sure you're checking that out. That information is also on the website. So for today, my presentation for FedAid connected projects, I'm going to give an overview of the Section 106 process. That is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. We're going to talk about applications, compliance steps, archaeology and historic and architectural surveys, consultation, what that looks like, how you're involved, some of the things we do back office to kind of help shepherd your project through, our interaction with SHPO, and then I'm going to touch on transportation alternatives just a little bit. Section 106 process. The project development guideline, or the IM that I referenced earlier that was just updated, outlines requirements and procedures. The IM also sets forth a set of 4 regulations, the primary of which is the 106 process. The other main one we deal with are the Iowa burials laws. When you're dealing with archaeology that has human remains on it, historic or prehistoric, those are the 2 main we deal with most. human remains, and then obviously Section 106. For cities and counties, 314.24 and 263B5 are also cultural resource related state guidelines. So even on state projects, there are requirements to be followed, whether there's no funding in there. If you need more information or you have questions about that, certainly let me know. We deal with that on the primary side for our state funded only projects. I'll talk about a specific example. But 106 applies to all federal actions that may affect historic properties. And historic properties are broadly defined. For us, that can be a historic barn, it could be a historic cemetery, it could be a commercial historic district, archaeology sites. We also deal with sites of religious or cultural significance. And I won't get into all those types in a big or in deep detail, but just know there's a lot of things that can be included in what's defined as a historic property. 106 process is initiated, in this case, in this setting, by Federal Highway Administration and the Fed aid you're receiving. But as Deanne mentioned and Mary Kay mentioned also, it's also connected to permitting. So if you've got a core permit, 106 kicks in. Same with applications. We deal with that on the primary highway side, and I've got a project right now where we'll have significant impacts to an archaeology site. There's no federal funding in it from Fed Highway. We do have to get an IP from the Corps to complete the project. So in this case, we're working through the Corps' version of Section 106. So just know that we serve that role too. When Fed Highway isn't involved, Section 106 oftentimes can be included if you've got to get a permit. Any questions about that? The other thing I want to mention is we deal with varying levels of effect, everything from destruction or a demolition all the way down to indirect effects like vibration. So just know that the scheme of effects is commensurate, the way the CFR classifies it, it's commensurate with your undertaking. So visual effects, if you have a tall project, vibration effects, it's a whole slew of things that can be included in that. Application. Regulations for completing the process are issued by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. If you've gone through this process before, which I see a lot of familiar faces out there, you guys have, we deal with the State Historic Preservation Office. On the national level, there is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and they provide a lot of guidance with the National Park Service on how 106 actually gets done. Anytime there's updates, it comes through the ACHP. For those of you, I'll touch on this even though we're specific to Fed Highway. For those of you who do from time to time pursue FEMA funding, or perhaps you have some HUD funding for a specific project, different agencies have different rules about how 106 can be delegated. HUD has a unique set of rules where they can delegate all the way down to the applicant. Fed Highway in the state of Iowa has delegated the majority of 106 activities to the DOT, which is why we are the funnel for your projects. In our statewide agreement with the State Historic Preservation Office and the Federal Highway Administration, they want those projects coming through the DOT. But I mentioned those other agencies just because, you know, if you have a ER project or a disaster and you pursue some FEMA funding, their rules are completely different. One of the things you heard Deanne talk about was 4F. 4F only applies to the Federal Highway Administration. That came out of the Department of Transportation Act in 1966. You talk to somebody in FEMA about 4F, and they might think you're speaking German. And that's okay. But just FYI, if you're dealing with different agencies, know there's different funding options and requirements out there. 106 is about consultation. 99% of our consultation is carried out with the State Historic Preservation Office. However, one of those back office interactions that you may not see, you know, depending on the resources you're dealing with, we consult with local historic preservation commissions, local historic societies, a number of Native American tribes and nations, most of which aren't resident anymore, but still have an ancestral or ceded land connection. Those ceded treaty rights provide them unique legal capabilities that don't extend to other entities. So that's one of the things that we take care of on the backside of your project. If you're interested to know more about that, certainly let your cultural resource manager know, but know that that consultation is going on the backside of your project. So when we might ask for clarification about easement or something like that with regard to your project, oftentimes it's dealing with one of those consulting parties. That's where that question came from. Compliance steps, no different than NEPA, and same with Mary Kay and T&E. Is it a federal undertaking? If it's not a federal undertaking, 106 doesn't kick in. I mentioned those two primary pieces of state code before, but if there's no Fed aid, 106 does not apply. The other thing that's important to mention, particularly with some of the enhancement work we do or the enhancement grants we fund, if there's no brick and mortar component, you know, you're pursuing Fed funding for a grant program that basically culminates in a meeting or a planning document, there are exclusions for that. And those are the kinds of clearances that we send out, you know, days or a couple weeks after you submit your concept. Those meet the exclusions that come along with our agreements. What we primarily look for are things like right-of-way acquisition, and I should note that we look at permanent and temporary easement really under one total, simply because if you have temporary easement, you can impact a historic resource, whether you acquire that permanently over time or not. Ground disturbance, vibration, buildings or structures over 50 years. I should also note, we haven't dealt with this so much on the LPA side just yet. We've been dealing with it quite a bit on the primary side, and I just got a report this morning from Iowa 16 down in Lee County. We are starting to see more and more transportation-related resources being eligible for the National Register. So we're, for the most part, all of us are familiar with some of the old bridges that are out there. We have dealt with historic transportation routes. This particular segment was funded by a local, and the Highway Commission built it. But it was one of the few examples in Iowa where you have a private entity putting up money for a paved road in the 1920s. So just know that there are elements out there that you could run into, even with a paving project. So historic transportation resources, keep those on the mind. If you have to boil 106 down to 3 steps, those would be identifying and evaluating resources, assessing adverse effects, and then consultation on those adverse effects. The vast majority of the LPA projects we do not have adverse effects for cultural resources. Typically, we deal with about 2 or 3 a year. If you're one of those 2 or 3 a year, you're going to work with us intimately, but for the most part, the majority of our projects don't. And that's through avoidance and minimization. We're no different than the other OLE speakers you've heard this morning. We look to avoid, minimize, and only mitigate where we have to. I want to touch a little bit. Oh, shoot, I'm not clicking along here. Somebody should have yelled at me. Historic and archaeological surveys. This is that note I mentioned earlier with regard to your recommendation. And I'm pinch hitting this morning. This presentation was going to be given by somebody else. One of the things I would add on this slide, if you're not familiar with it, write this down, iSites Public. iSites Public is a place you can go. Everyone has access to it, but it does provide you some preliminary information on the resources that are out there. So Mary Kay talked about the Fish and Wildlife website that has habitat and species listed on it, same with DNR. This is that equivalent for this other resource type for cultural resources. So iSites Public has the number of archaeology sites recorded in your section, the township section range that your project might be in or might clip through, as well as standing structure inventory and National Register Historic District polygon data. So you can use that to make an assessment for your concept statement. We look at the same data, it's just a different version of it, but that's a tool that can save you a lot of time and effort. So check out iSites Public. We actually support it, even though it's offered by the Office of the State Archaeologist. It sits on a DOT server because it's an important component of what you guys do out there. So if you're not familiar with it, check that out. If you get to a point where we make a recommendation for you, or you know ahead of time based on the impacts of your project that you're going to need an archaeological survey or a historic architectural investigation, one of the important critical elements you're going to need to provide to your consultant is an accurate description of what your undertaking is. And Mary Kay or Deanne talked a little earlier about providing a little bit of buffer around your project area. We always recommend that with any survey work you're going to do. If all you survey is what you intend for your construction limits or the needs of the project, that doesn't provide you any wiggle room if you find something. I'll give you an example. For a lot of big corridor work that we do, US 20, US 61, you know, you name your state route, when we're out there, sometimes our survey corridors are as wide as a quarter mile. And the reason is, it's, in the end, it saves us quite a bit of resource in terms of money, but a lot of resource in terms of time. Because if we do have a resource we identify where we need to avoid, we have to remobilize, we have to resurvey, we have to re-report. And so our recommendation for you today, you know, if you've got a project coming up where you think you're going to need some survey more than you're going to need. It's going to save you time and effort in the end. You know, I think all of us look at the bottom line of those things and we think, okay, you know, this is a $15,000 survey. Can we make it a $10,000 survey? Your cultural resource consultants in the state, particularly if you're using the ones that are pre-qualified or on the AAA list or things like that, they're going to know some best practices for you. And I recommend to follow those simply because your $15,000 survey that you tried to cut down to 10 or under can turn into 23 when you have to go back out. And that doesn't do anybody any good. The other thing is, if you have a consultant in the field and they identify a resource, I always recommend see if they can't find a solution in the field. So if you've got a trail project or you're looking at some easement one way or the other on your bridge and they identify a resource in a quadrant or on your trail, see if that can't find you a solution in the field. Because again, you're saving the mobilization costs, you're saving the reporting costs, and it might only be another day of field work for your consultant since they're already there. So never hesitate to find some quick decision making that can really help you in the field. Sure, yeah. Trail projects, the question is elaborate, you know, how can someone find a solution for you? Envision a rural trail project through a county park, or maybe a small bypass or a cutoff for a new bridge alignment. Bridge is getting old. We're going to solve some geometry issues with this project. Don't hesitate to give your consultant a little bigger project area than you're going to need, simply because a lot of times we can shift a project a little bit or perhaps increase the length of a bridge to span a resource too, and that keeps you entirely out of the mitigation project. Typically, mitigation for us can be up to 18 months. I don't advise any less than that. So again, don't hesitate to work with your consultant to get creative in the field. That avoidance concept can really help save you time and money down the road and ultimately get your project delivered on time. One other thing I want to touch on, if you've worked with us much at all in the past, you've probably seen a recommendation for a cultural resource evaluation. The cultural resource evaluation that we provide, that service from the Office of State Archaeologist, is free to the city and county. The DOT does pay for that. So ultimately, as taxpayers, we do pay for it. When we centralize it, we basically build an expedited option for you guys to use if you need it. However, the one thing I do request, as I mentioned, the DOT does pay for those CREs. So I've seen LPAs or cities or consultants come in and do lots and lots of those at a time. Do them on an as-needed basis, just so we're not doing more than is needed and spending more resources there when we need to. We just ask that you wear your owner's hat a little bit when it comes to those. Consultation. As I mentioned earlier, consultation really is at the heart of the Section 106 process. This can be kind of a challenge for some individuals and personalities to deal with. Consultation does not always arrive us at a yes or no or a black and white decision. Sometimes working with the SHPO, they'll say, well, we really need more data to answer our question. and I leave the meeting, and the project management team says, so what do we have to do? It's kind of gray. That's just the nature of consultation. A lot of times there's a conception out there that SHPO provides clearance to a project. That's entirely false. In 106, the federal agency has the ultimate decision. So if Federal Highway has to get involved with your project, yes, we certainly put a lot of weight on anything, any comments a consulting party gives us, a direction SHPO wants us to take, or something to investigate. But ultimately, Federal Highway has the ultimate decision, no different than if you're working with FEMA or one of those other federal agencies. But I want to stress that SHPO does not clear a project. They are one of many consulting parties. The other thing about that, if you're working heftily with an HPC or a local historical society, they have the same capability that any of the other consulting parties do. Same with the Native American tribes we work with. So if you're dealing with one of those very sensitive archaeology sites, or you have a situation where you have human remains, SHPO is just one of those voices that we interact with. Let's talk a little bit about review timelines. Officially, SHPO has 30 days to review a project. We do not like to move on, particularly when there's a kind of a high-profile resource involved, without SHPO concurrence. It's just a good business practice for us. So we will offer them additional time, 5 days, 10 days if they need it. Typically right now, I was looking at the database earlier, our SHPO review time is averaging about 15 days. As you might guess, that is entirely commensurate with the complexity of the project. So if we send them down 300-page phase 2 investigation that covers 16 archaeological sites, it's not realistic to think we're going to get that back in 15 days. The other thing I'll say with this, we always want to know what the status is. We are working to build an online electronic system that we share with SHPO. Other consulting parties will have access to this. One of the things that will deliver us is a better way to let people know what the status of their project is. But if you're asking, particularly folks that ask more than a week or even sometimes daily, no, I'm not going to ask anybody to raise their hand. When you're constantly inquiring about the status of a project, that really stifles our ability to make a review, or same with SHPO. So just be patient there. Anything else here? That really covers it about, really for the most part covers our consultation with SHPO. The other thing I want to mention with that bottom bullet is the clearance that Deanne ended her presentation with. She needs the cultural resource clearance before she can issue her or their, the NEPA team's clearance. So think of it like a set of dominoes. Once you have cultural, then you can get NEPA thereafter. But cultural is usually the first clearance you'll see issued. We do the same thing as NEPA. We issue that out to you in the form of an email memo. I want to talk lastly here a little bit about the Transportation Alternatives Program. And I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but there are some specific rules that come with transportation enhancements, particularly when dealing with Section 4F properties. If we've got a historic depot restoration or some kind of historic site that has a transportation nexus and you receive Transportation Alternatives Program funding, there are unique situations that come with that, as opposed to a typical transportation STP, BRF type project. Consultation on these types of projects is typically pretty heavy-handed, particularly on the rehabilitation projects. Trail projects, grant projects, things like that, we really do strive to avoid adverse effects on these, to the tune of when we sit down with Fed Highway, they may say another alternative needs to be found. We're not going to impact this historic property for a trail project or something like that. So just be aware of that. We take adverse effects very seriously. It requires us to consult directly with the ACHP in Washington. Federal Highway has to get involved, and there are times where they will say, let's find another alternative. So just be prepared. Lastly, and this really is specific to those restorations and rehabilitations, we don't typically consult much with SHPO's preservation architect, but if you have one of these types of projects, It's the kind of thing where we're meeting sometimes a couple times a month when you're getting down to the very fine details of your project. And again, I know that doesn't include everybody in the room, but if you're dealing with one of those TAP projects, they can be a great funding source for rehabilitation of historic properties, but they do come with all the bells and whistles that accompany federal funding. I want to touch a little bit on the advisory council flow chart. This is moving all the way through the process, initiating 106. No potential to cause effect. That's that exclusion category I mentioned early on where we can typically clear a project in just a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks. No historic properties affected is a determination we make a lot. And that's not to say that there are no historic properties connected to your undertaking. There is no effect to them is ultimately what we're suggesting. In 2012, when we rewrote our statewide programmatic agreement, we rolled out a minor projects program. Minor projects, no historic properties affected, means that you meet that minor projects condition. But ultimately, we're still resting on the formal no historic properties affected. Another determination you'll see us use quite a bit is no adverse effect, or listed on this slide as no historic properties adversely affected. We use this determination quite a bit on projects, and we're going to see more and more of these. This is going to be an increasing category of project type for a long time. Repavement in a small downtown where you might have a commercial historic district, or individually eligible properties, individually listed properties, your county courthouse. These are the kinds of projects where we will not have an adverse effect, but we will condition the project as such. That might mean vibration monitoring. It might be a set of plan notes to the contractor, informing them, letting them know what they need to be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. But no adverse effect oftentimes comes with conditions. So if you see one of these or you have questions, make sure you're on top of that, because usually at that point we're all the way down the process getting information into plans, or perhaps even a special provision. And then lastly, adverse effects. Adverse effects are resolved one of two ways: a programmatic agreement, which is usually for a particular project. An example there would be the Fort Madison bypass. We did a PA on the whole project, knowing that we were going to impact multiple sites. Or in memorandum of agreement, again, a formal legal document reviewed by the ACHP, Federal Highway Legal, where we're wrapping up 106 for usually a specific property. So one of two agreements that we'll put in place should you have an adverse effect. There's a reference to the IM. As I mentioned, that it was recently updated. A couple of websites there. Certainly check those out. There's a